Today's speaker is Eric Posner. I don't think that Eric Posner really needs an introduction for almost anyone who has been alive in legal academia for the past 20 years. So I don't really dare to really try to summarize his numerous books and pieces on an enormously attractive range of topics. So I'll simply say that his lecture today is in a somewhat provocative tone on the limits of normative law and economics and how relevant is normative law and economics for legal policy. And I'll just give the floor to Eric.
Thanks so much, Fernando. Let me just share my slide here, my slides. Here we go. Okay, yes, it's great to have a chance to talk to you all. I'm sorry that we're not together in Chicago or somewhere else, but it's really nice to be able to speak to people around the world thanks to this amazing technology. And as Fernando mentioned, today I'm going to talk about the boundaries of normative law and economics. I'm not going to speak for too long, maybe half an hour, maybe a little bit more, because I'm anxious to hear your questions. Let me start by just giving you a kind of an outline of what I'm going to talk about, and then I'll go into more detail. There are, the basic point I want to make is about what scholars who engage in law and economics or normative law and economics are implicitly assuming when they make reform proposals to courts or to regulators or to the government generally. So as you know, when people write law and economics articles, they're typically normative in orientation. They typically make an argument that the law should be changed in some way because it will make people better off as a result. And virtually all law and economics articles make four kind of very important assumptions. The first is welfarism. The second is distributional irrelevance. The third is the insignificance of non-welfarist values. And the fourth is that people are rational actors. And I'm going to spend the bulk of this talk going through in detail what those four assumptions mean. And my main point is that while law and economics people typically take these assumptions for granted, outside of law and economics, outside of economics, they're all controversial. And because they're controversial, law and economics proposals are often met with significant skepticism. And in some cases, the skepticism is justified. In other cases, it's not. But my worry is that because law and economics scholars are not self-conscious about these assumptions, don't address them directly very often, the entire methodology is in a sense tainted a little bit. People who are outside of law and economics, other legal scholars, other policy analysts, often, I think, believe that law and economics is either inaccurate or ideologically biased because of these assumptions. And I don't think that's fair, but I do think law and economics has to be more clear about what these assumptions are and when they're justified and when they're not. And so I'll talk at the end about how these problems can be overcome. Basically, there are two ways they can be overcome. Either the analyst, the law and economics scholar who's writing an article, can address them explicitly in the course of making a particular reform proposal, or he or she can produce what I call a modular analysis. And I'll explain what I mean using an example in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to start with an example from a paper by Louis Caplow and Steve Chevelle called The Optimal Law Enforcement with Self-Reported Behavior. This is a paper from quite some time ago. I think it was 1994. I choose this paper it's basically randomly. I mean, it's a very good paper, and it's very clear. And I just happened to be sort of using it at the time that I was writing this paper. So I'm just going to use this. But think of this as a very kind of standard type of law and economics paper. And the paper addresses an interesting question, which is, suppose a firm engages in wrongdoings from time to time. Maybe it's a corporation, for example, that engages in accounting fraud or violates some law. And as is often the case, the victim of the wrongdoing may not be aware of it. So for example, in the standard tort context where, let's say, a driver hits a pedestrian, the pedestrian obviously knows that he's been injured and can sue the driver. But in a lot of contexts, victims of who caused the injury. So for example, if a corporation owns a factory that pollutes the air, I might be injured by this pollution, but I may not even be aware that I'm being injured. And so the government steps in and monitors the company in order to make sure that it's not engaging in the bad behavior. And going back to Becker, people have pointed out that what the government should do is engage in random audits, meaning from time to time, they should inspect factories or inspect corporate records. And they shouldn't inspect all of them, that's very expensive, but if they randomize and impose a sanction that's high enough on wrongdoers, that will be the optimal way to deter this type of bad behavior. But as Caplow and Chevelle points out, it's often the case that corporations can be required to self-report their wrongdoing. And this is kind of interesting because why would a corporation ever self-report? Why would it ever voluntarily disclose to the government that it's engaged in wrongdoing? And of course, the answer is you need to give the corporation an incentive to do that. So how do you do that? Well, so there's a kind of a paradox here, and this actually came up. One of my colleagues wrote a paper about how we could get businesses to disclose that their employees have been infected by the coronavirus. A business might want to conceal that information rather than reveal it to the government because it's embarrassing and it might get sued. But at the same time, it's very important for the government and for public health for businesses to report to the public health authorities when they discover that an employee has been infected. And so what my colleague suggested was that the business would simply be given a safe harbor. It would be shielded from liability if it reports the infection of an employee. But the problem with that argument is that then the business doesn't have an incentive to protect their employees in the first place, or it has weak incentives because it knows that it won't be liable if it turns out that it didn't take sufficient precautions, as a result of which many of its employees or even customers got infected. And so the solution to this problem, which Caplow and Chevelle had anticipated 30 years ago, was that you have a kind of two tiers of sanctions. So the government engages in the random audit. So in the coronavirus example, the government would from time to time inspect the premises of businesses to make sure that they're taking precautions or monitor the employees. And if the employer did not take sufficient safety precautions and also failed to report that employees are sick, then the government would throw the book at the employer. That what Caplow and Chevelle calls maximal sanctions would be imposed. But if the firms report wrongdoing voluntarily to the government imposes an intermediate sanction, which is basically lower than the maximal sanction and greater than zero. Caplow and Chevelle actually provide a formula for this. And so what the firm thinks is, what the firm should think if the optimal system is put into place, the firm should think, well, you know, I'm going to take precautions because if my employees get sick and the government finds out about it, I will get punished. And so to avoid the punishment, I'll take precautions. But at the same time, if an infection occurs despite my precautions, I'm going to report that to the government, even though I'm going to get this intermediate sanction. Because if I don't report it to the government and the government performs an audit and finds out, then it's going to, you know, impose this very high sanction on me. And so that's what the paper shows. And, you know, I like this paper a lot because it's so elegant and because this insight can be applied in many settings. It could be applied, for example, to corporate wrongdoing, but it could also be applied to plea bargaining. Plea bargaining is an example of self-reporting, or it could be just be applied to all kinds of types of individual behavior. So, for example, if you discover that in your last tax filing you made an error, you might want to not tell the government about this. But if you know that there's a small chance of an audit that will discover it, and that a very high sanction would be imposed upon you if you haven't reported it, then that will give you an incentive to report it, and that saves the government a lot of work. So, despite the elegance of this argument, there are these four assumptions that may be controversial in different settings. And so I've just repeated the four assumptions I told you about before at the top of the slide. But if you look at the bottom, one of the really powerful things about law and economics is how abstract these arguments are, and so how they can be applied in a lot of different settings. But the plausibility of these assumptions may not be as strong in some settings as others. So in the first example, corporate self-reporting of wrongdoing by employees, what I started with. So for example, the head of the corporation discovers that some of the employees have been engaged in wrongdoing. Well, we can imagine that the corporation is a sophisticated entity, and it would respond, in a rational way to the incentives created by the Kaplan-Chevelle self-reporting mechanism. But if we skip down to the second, self-reporting by taxpayers or plea bargains by criminal defendants, we might be more skeptical that ordinary people can understand this regime as well as a corporate compliance department can. And there's also these distributional effects, or for example, we might be worried that more sophisticated people will understand the scheme and less sophisticated people won't, with the result that, in effect, less sophisticated people will end up paying higher sanctions than more sophisticated people, which will have perhaps undesirable distributional effects. Or we might be concerned about non-welfare values. We might think, okay, in the case of a corporation, it's perfectly logical to sanction the corporation a lot if it doesn't report wrongdoing by employees. But we might feel less confident of that assumption in the context of criminal defendants. Whether somebody who's been accused of a crime should admit it to a court in return for a lower sentence, that's kind of more complicated from a moral standpoint. Maybe we think that it's good for people to show remorse by admitting to their crimes, or maybe we think that it's humiliating to force people or effectively give them strong incentives to confess a crime in open court. And these are complicated moral questions that I now want to address in a little more detail. Okay, so this first assumption, welfarism based on unrestricted preferences. This is the standard assumption in normative economics. And it basically means that what we care about is the well-being of people. And well-being, has this kind of intuitive meaning. We want people to do well. We want them to flourish. But if you look at the philosophy literature, there are controversies about what well-being means that go back centuries. So for example, Bentham thought that well-being was just a matter of your mental state, the chemicals flowing around in your brain. If you feel happy, that's good. If you feel sad, that's bad. That was Bentham's view. There's another view, starting with Mill, and which is embraced by a lot of philosophers today, which is a person does well if certain objective indicators of well-being have been satisfied. So for example, the person has adequate food and has leisure time, has autonomy and meaningful work, has family and relationships, and all those things have to be satisfied for a person, if we want to say that a person is doing well. And then there's the economic view, which is that what we're really looking at are people's preferences or desires. And the more those preferences are satisfied, the better off the person is. And even there's a further wrinkle, which is that while economists tend to take preferences as given, that is to say, whatever my preferences are at the moment, if they're satisfied, I'm better off. Philosophers are more skeptical of that view. And for example, if I'm a drug addict and all I want are more drugs, from an economist standpoint, then I'm made better off if I'm given more drugs. But most philosophers would say, no, if the drugs just, turn me into a kind of an automaton and I'm not really enjoying life, then giving drugs to me doesn't make me better off. And so preferences have to be looked at in a very careful way. Certain preferences are more legitimate than other preferences. Okay, so that's welfarism, and that's an enormous controversy. The economic view is very much a minority view among philosophers. And these more sophisticated views are much more widely accepted. So when a normative law and economics person says, well, the good thing about the self-reporting mechanism is that, it will reduce externalities with the result that people can, get what they want. A philosopher might say, well, it depends exactly, what they want and whether that's good. And that's something that economists don't talk about very much. Okay, second point, unimportance of distributional effects. So the usual criterion for evaluating a reform in law and economics is efficiency, Pareto efficiency or Calder-Hicks efficiency. And distributional effects are generally ignored. So for example, when Keppel and Chevelle write about the value of the self-reporting mechanism, they simply ignore the distributional effects that might arise if that mechanism is implemented in some real world setting. But in reality, people do care about distributional effects. They care about inequality and they care about poverty. Now, Keppel and Chevelle have a response to that, which is that the distributional effects should be addressed separately by the tax and transfer system. I'll say more about that in a moment, but there are questions about whether that's actually realistic and works as they and other people argue. Okay, the third point is the unimportance of impacts on non-welfare values. So, in the United States in legal scholarship, law and economics is quite dominant and important, but a lot of legal scholars talk about other values that they think are important. Dignity, for example, autonomy. In the context of criminal law, they often talk about retributive justice or corrective justice and tort law as well. And law and economics, again, mostly ignores these types of values, even though lots of people care about them. And then the final one is rational instrumental behavior. Now, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar about this problem, which is longstanding and has been challenged by behavioral economists now for many decades and psychologists before then. So I'm not going to go into much detail, but I do want to make the point that if you abandon or weaken this assumption, then the preference view of welfarism becomes somewhat harder to understand. Because if, for example, if you think that people frequently don't act in their self-interest for behavioral reasons, then of course you might think that their preferences are not, don't actually reflect their well-being. And so this too is a problem for law and economics. Now, one way to address these issues is to go back and look at how economics proper deals with them. That is, economists writing in economics journals in economics department. How do they deal with these four assumptions? After all, law and economics, inherits them from economics. So we can learn by going back and seeing what economists do. Well, one thing, probably most economists ignore these problems in the same way that law and economics does. And in fact, if you just pick up an economics journal, you'll see that a lot of the papers basically just identify externalities and then address how those externalities could be resolved through reform. Economists tend to say they don't make normative arguments at all. That's not actually true, although of course a lot of their papers are purely empirical papers. But I was just thumbing through, I don't remember what it was, one of the economics journals, and there was an article by Daron Acemoglu, a very distinguished economist, and some co-authors, and they were talking about externalities caused by the sharing of data, a very important topic. And toward the end of their paper, they talk about how these externalities could be addressed through legal reform. And basically, they just say, we could tax people, basically. We could tax people, and that would reduce the incentive to generate these negative externalities. And so they ignore all of these problems, and I think that's very common in economics. However, there are several fields in economics where these issues have been addressed directly. So the first is welfare economics, which, going back many decades, has been focused on, what normative criterion should economists use in order to evaluate public policy and make proposals for reform. And this literature goes back 100 years or more. It kind of started with a Benthamite view, but eventually economists developed these more rigorous and sophisticated tests for efficiency, such as the Pareto test, which says that a policy reform is good if it makes at least one person better off and no one worse off, or the Calder-Hicks test, which is basically a cost-benefit analysis. A policy reform is good if the people who benefit do better as a result of the reform than the people who are harmed by the policy reform. But the problem with these efficiency criteria is they actually rule out any distributional policy. A pure transfer from rich people to poor people through the tax system fails the Pareto test and the Calder-Hicks test because it makes some people worse off, and it's a pure transfer. So the Calder-Hicks test is not satisfied because the winners don't get more than the losers. And economists realized very early on that if they make policy reforms that disregard the distributional impacts, people are going to be skeptical about them. And so eventually, kind of two things happened. One is that this strategy of trying to come up with a neutral criterion for evaluating policy reforms was dropped. I think eventually most economists decided this was impossible. But what they do say, and you hear this a lot, is that what economists will do is focus on efficiency, and the policymaker, him or herself, will make distributional judgments. So what some economists say, they portray the economist as an advisor who says, look, there are a number of reforms that are efficient, or some reforms are more efficient than others. I'm going to give you a list of them. And then you can make the judgment based on the distributional impact that you care about. So that's not terribly satisfactory. In the public finance literature, interestingly, in recent years, economists have basically just used a social welfare function approach, where they can build in distributional values and sometimes even non-welfarist values. And if you like, in the question and answer session, I can talk more about that. So, it is possible to use a social welfare function, which is egalitarian, and then, you know, evaluate different tax schemes, for example, and be able to say which, you know, are best. Of course, the problem is that economists don't have any way to determine what the, you know, what the distributional values actually are, you know, how egalitarian you want your social welfare function to be. So these reform proposals are also somewhat tentative, and it's assumed that the policymaker will take them into account, but not necessarily follow exactly what the economist proposes. In behavioral economics, there hasn't been a huge amount of attention to normative implications, although behavioral economists make normative proposals all the time. But, you know, I think you know, certainly people like Kahneman and others are inclined toward a hedonic approach, that is the Benthamite approach, where what the behavioral economist is trying to do is maximize happiness, or, well, you know, that version of well-being, because they're skeptical that people's preferences reflect their well-being, as I mentioned before. And then finally, I want to mention mechanism design or market design, which is very interesting. So there's a famous proposal by Alvin Roth, an economist, called the kidney exchange system. And so in the United States and virtually every other country, it is illegal for a person to sell one of his kidneys to a person who needs a kidney because that person is sick. And economists going back to Becker have criticized this ban on the sale of kidneys and other organs because, you know, it seems like it's a ban on Pareto efficient transactions. I have 2 kidneys and I'm very healthy. I need money. You don't have any kidneys. You need a kidney and you have a lot of money. If you pay me and I give you my kidney, we're both better off. So now Roth doesn't try to defend this moral view. But he works with it. So what he does is he designs a system that respects this, what he calls a repugnance toward the sale of body parts, but at the same time makes it possible for kidneys to be transferred from some people who don't need them as much to people who do. And the system is rather complicated, but the basic idea is there are, you know, often people will donate a kidney to a close relative who needs the kidney, and people will do that voluntarily, they're not compensated. But what the problem is that there could be incompatibility of the immunological systems of the 2 people, which makes the donation impossible. And so what Roth says is, well, look, we'll find different pairs of people who are incompatible. So let's suppose I want to, you know, donate my kidney to Fernando, but we're incompatible. And then, you know, my wife wants to donate her kidney to Norma, and they're incompatible. But maybe my wife, if my wife is compatible with Fernando and I'm compatible with Norma, we can create this kidney chain where I donate my kidney to Norma and my wife donates her kidney to Fernando, and we're all better off as a result. Okay, this is very complicated, these kidney chains, which can have dozens of people in them. But it's a way to, he creates an economic model that provides people with the incentives and the mechanism for doing that, rather than trying to argue that this taboo against the sale of kidneys is wrong. Now, let's see how we're doing on time. So in traditional law and economics, you know, there's a kind of a similar response to the ignore view. The ignore view, or the, you know, let the policymaker determine distributional effects. So some of the law and economics people just do efficiency analysis the way economists normally do. Keppel and Javel are well known for taking what I call an institutional response, which is, as I mentioned before, you have redistribution occur through the tax and transfer system. But as I mentioned, you know, that's a bit unsatisfactory because a lot of people believe that reforms should respect norms of distributive justice. So, for example, people have been talking lately about, you know, if a vaccine is created and there's not enough to go around for everybody who might become a victim of the coronavirus, who should get it first? Well, from an economic perspective, rich people should get it first, right? Because rich people can pay more, and we could just have the vaccine companies sell into the market, and wealthy people would buy the vaccine. But that strikes a lot of people as as really unjust, and that the people who should get the vaccine first would be, let's say, first responders and maybe, poor people who live in crowded conditions and are more vulnerable to the coronavirus. Capel and Chevelle, in a famous book called Fairness versus Welfare, also deal with the problem of non-welfarist values, which they call fairness values. And, they take basically three strategies. In some cases, they just seem to express skepticism that non-welfarist values are authentic and important. So people think, for example, most people think that redistributive justice is important. So the punishment should fit the crime. But as we know from Becker, sometimes we might want to punish people who commit less serious crimes because it's hard to detect them. We should punish them a lot, and maybe people who commit more serious crimes that are easy to detect, we should punish less. And that's very much in tension with people's sense of redistributive justice, of retributive justice. So Capel and Chevelle say, well, that's just kind of dumb, because if we don't follow Becker's approach, we're going to waste a lot of resources. That's true, but it just seems to be the case that in the real world, people have these very strong moral values, and it's worth it to people to waste resources if that's the consequence of obeying those non-welfarist values. So for example, people seem to be dead set against a market in kidneys, even though clearly that would make everybody better off in a welfarist sense. And the reason is that there's this kind of taboo or norm that people take seriously. Another approach they take is what I call welfarizing non-welfarist values, which is to take a non-welfarist value and claim that it actually reflects welfare. So for example, some philosophers have defended the taboo on sales of kidneys by arguing that in reality, if it were possible to sell kidneys, that would end up hurting poor people who would make bad decisions. That's a possible approach, but it's probably doesn't reflect people's real moral intuitions. And the third thing that Capel and Chevelle do is they basically say, okay, well, if people really have these non-welfarist preferences, we'll take them into account in our efficiency analysis. And so effectively that would mean is we wouldn't have a taboo on kidney sales unless we actually figured out that people who are opposed to the sales were willing to pay more than the people who would benefit from the sales. But that again is not actually how people engage in moral analysis. So now, does this mean that Capel and Chevelle's self-reporting mechanism is of no value? And I don't think that's the case. I think the way to think about it is as what I call a modular proposal, meaning, there's an insight that they have about how people might behave to certain incentives in a certain setting that would be beneficial for society. But we can't just rest with their insight. When we actually apply it to the real world, we have to take into account whether the four premises, the four assumptions are correct, and how that proposal should be modified if they're not correct or only partially correct. So that's what I mean by a modular proposal. I think in the interest of time, let me just skip ahead to the conclusion. This diagram sort of gives you a sense of my argument. There's the public finance literature, the welfare economics literature, and the behavioral economics literature, which make different types of assumptions, departing from the standard economic approach, which treats all four assumptions as correct. And so public finance in recent years has been relaxing the distributional irrelevance assumption. The behavioral economics approach relaxes the assumption that people are rational actors, and to some extent, the preference satisfaction assumption. And welfare economics sometimes relaxes the assumption that non-welfarist values are unimportant. And I think what's kind of complicated for law and economics is it overlaps with all of these different approaches without being very clear about what its assumptions are or should be. Okay, so let me just mention, there's another type of law and economics argument, which I call futility arguments. These are arguments that show that, even if all of the assumptions are wrong, a particular proposal is still bad because it simply makes everybody worse off, period. it's just a waste of resources, and it doesn't actually achieve its objective. So people have sometimes made this argument about the minimum wage law. I don't agree with this argument, but it is an argument. The argument is if the minimum wage law is very high, rather than helping workers, employers will just fire workers. And so minimum wages is a futile way of trying to make people better off. Okay, so that's a type of argument that's possible. The modular arguments are also important. And so I do think people like Capel and Chevelle should continue to make these types of abstract law and economics arguments, but we have to use them carefully when we actually apply them to public policy. And the third approach is that, the law and economics people can, to some extent, when they write articles and make proposals for how to make the world a better place, they could address these assumptions explicitly. They can talk about the extent to which their reform assumes that people are rational or not, and if people aren't that rational, how the reform should be adjusted to take that into account, and whether their reform will be in tension with non-welfarist values, and what the implications of that might be. And there are people who do that from time to time, but it is a relatively small number of people, and I think more people should write work of this type. So with that, Fernando, I'm done, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Many thanks, Eric, for the talk, and also pretty close to your goal of 30 minutes. We have plenty of time for questions and comments. I've already have a few, so I'll start. Eric has said that he prefers to respond each comment or each question separately. So I'll start with some of the questions that we already have. I think the first one is Yun Chen Chang, who's raised his hand and wants to address some questions to Eric. Yun Chen, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Fernando, and thanks, Eric, for the great talk. I just saw the paper on SSR and I haven't finished reading it, but I'm looking forward to read it. I have two questions, one perhaps minor point, one more important point. First point, I don't understand why you say under Kaldor-Hicks efficiency, it cannot justify a pure and effective wealth transfer system, because given that money has diminished monetary utility, we could say for the rich to lose $100, they lose 90 in terms of utility, and for the poor to receive like 100, they get like 110 in utilities. So in that sense, in aggregate, we could say Kaldor-Hicks can justify a pure and effective wealth transfer. And second larger point is, I think, because I am writing the same topic in Chinese in my forthcoming book. And among all these research and thesis, I think your book with Adler on a new foundation for cost-benefit analysis, I think works better, at least for my potential audience. So there I make the argument that if we want to talk about welfare, then we could stick to Kaldor-Hicks or Pareto, Kaldor-Hicks being more pragmatic, but Kaldor-Hicks has this problem. If we really use this textbook version of Kaldor-Hicks, then essentially we want the policymaker to ask a person one by one, a person, what is your willingness to pay? Or what is your utility change from law X to law Y? And this information cost burden makes really implemented a Kaldor-Hicks task impossible. So like you argue, cost-benefit analysis being a pragmatic decision-making tool could bypass this Kaldor-Hicks problem, because assume that people don't have preference for redistribution or non-welfarist value, then, and they care only about efficiency, then cost-benefit analysis, even though they operate on the macro or aggregate level, will reach the same result if we ask people using the Kaldor-Hicks formula, because all these costs and benefits will be falling on some person, so for cost on some person and benefit on some other person, but in aggregate, they're equivalent. So we can use CBA to bypass the difficulty of implementing Calder-Hicks. But the problem is, once we recognize that people have non-welfarist or non-self-interest values, such as concern for others, redistribution value, then the CBA and Calder-Hicks, they no longer are equivalent. Using CBA, we only know efficiency, but carrying out Calder-Hicks, we know about welfare, which include but not limited to efficiency. So I don't know whether this represents, I think, your thought in 2006 and whether it reflects your thoughts now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Yan-Chen, and also good to see you. So first of all, Calder-Hicks. So Calder-Hicks has a technical definition. It's not the same thing as welfare. Calder-Hicks and cost-benefit analysis is like this as well. Just looks at resources that people have or dollars in the case of cost-benefit analysis. So one way that economists will often describe Calder-Hicks is that a proposal satisfies the Calder-Hicks criterion if the winners could overcompensate the losers. And that means in resources, it doesn't mean in utility. So if you just move $100 from one group of people to another, the hypothetical compensation will just, the winners can give the 100 back to the losers, but that's not overcompensation. That's just returning the money. So that fails the Calder-Hicks standard. And this is true in cost-benefit analysis as well. Cost-benefit analysis uses real, dollar effects. So if we did a cost-benefit analysis of a tax and transfer system that took $100 from me and gave it to you, we would say, well, how much would Eric be willing to pay for that, to avoid that? 100. How much would Yan-Chen be willing to pay for that? 100. So it just cancels out, and the transfer would not pass a cost-benefit analysis. So this was a problem. And economists originally, understanding this problem and exactly your point, tried to address it by creating social welfare functions, where the diminishing marginal utility of $1 could be incorporated directly. But the social welfare function approach has its own complexities. So for your second question, in many ways, this paper is just an application of the ideas in the book I wrote with Matt Adler to the more general setting of law and economics. You can kind of incorporate into cost-benefit analysis or Calder-Hicks criterion an assumption that people care about other people. And then you could have more or less efficient ways of transferring resources. But none of these approaches address the problem of non-welfarist moral values. And so to the extent a particular policy proposal implicates these non-welfarist values, you just have to, the policymaker has to depart from the economic standard. I mean, it could be relevant in for the design of the proposal, but the proposal couldn't stand or fall on them. So again, take the kidney exchange proposal of Alvin Roth, which I think is a good example. If we're going to respect people's views that it's immoral, a system in which people were allowed to sell kidneys is immoral, is just wrong, then the economist can't argue with that. The economist isn't a philosopher. The best an economist could do is propose a system which allows the non-repugnant transfers of organs to continue. There are different ways of doing that, and they can be evaluated using the efficiency criterion. That's what Roth does. So he designs one system, but there are other systems that are possible. And so there is still a role for law and economics or economics, but it's a more limited role.
Yan-Chen, do you want to react to that, or should we move on to the questions?
Why don't we move on to let other people ask questions, Fernando? There are some more questions
Um,
in the chat.
I have a few questions in the chat, but some of them prefer just simply to text this time. Well, let me read you a couple of questions that I have in the chat, and then I'll have a few questions of my own. We have a question about vaccine distribution, and basically saying, well, you've mentioned that efficiency, or at least a possible version of efficiency, would call for an auction of the vaccine in these critical conditions concerning COVID-19. What is your take on the idea of preserving or changing the patent system with respect to vaccines?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. You know, I haven't thought much about this, but the problem, you know, as is well known, the patent system, you know, has certain benefits and certain costs. The benefit is that it gives innovators a strong incentive to, in this case, come up with a vaccine, because they'll have a monopoly over their vaccine, which means that they can charge a lot of money, and as a result, you know, they'll be compensated for the cost and risk of developing the vaccine. But of course, on the other side, if they have a monopoly over their vaccine, then they're going to want to withhold it to the extent, in order to reduce supply, so that they can charge the highest price possible. And of course, that would be terrible, because if the vaccine isn't distributed widely, a lot of people will die, and the pandemic won't be fully addressed. So the patent system is controversial already, but to the extent that it works, you know, for other types of innovation, it doesn't necessarily work in for this particular public health problem. Now, what governments seem to be doing is simply directly paying these companies, even in advance, for their to compensate them for their risk and cost, which strikes me as a sensible thing to do. I do want to say, though, that, you know, if we just stuck with the traditional patent system, there's both an efficiency loss, because there are externalities, they're positive externalities from the vaccine. If I get vaccinated, that will benefit the people I interact with, even if they don't get vaccinated. Or the vaccine in general will be more effective the more people take it. So that's a reason for the government intervening and buying vaccines for people. But the patent system also is quite harsh from a distributional perspective, because it will lead to higher prices in general. And so that would mean, as I mentioned before, that wealthier people would have access to a vaccine and poorer people wouldn't, which I think, you know, in the current context would strike people as many people as unjust.
Okay, I'll read a couple of, okay, I think Yun Qian wants to respond to your previous comments, so Yun Qian.
Hi, Eric. So could we say that it's possible to structure, maybe too complicated, to structure a three-level value system? At the bottom is efficiency, pure efficiency, which can be carried out by cost-benefit analysis. And then there are other values that are in people's preference. For example, as Kaplan and Chauvel kind of assume or posit, people cares about income distribution. And then there are the values that you said are not contained by people's preference, but are objectively important. So then scholar could say, okay, if we have only econ training, I do efficiency analysis. If I know something about income distribution, I do welfare, which include income distribution and efficiency. And then if I have more confidence in having philosophical training, I'm doing others, then I add up the third layer of the non-welfarist value. Would that be a kind of like a division of labor that could make people contribute their strengths?
Yeah, yes, I think that's correct. And actually in the paper, I do talk about the division of labor approach. You know, we can think of people with different types of training contributing to a policy proposal based on, you know, what they know. And so economists can talk about efficiency, which of course is always important because we don't want to waste resources. But philosophers can contribute to the philosophical aspect of things. Now, I don't want to be, overly rigid about this. A lot of economists actually are morally sophisticated people. They just refrain from making moral arguments. I think law professors also, at least in the United States, and I think in other countries, we are exposed to arguments from multiple disciplines, philosophy, history, economics, and so forth. And so we're in a good position, even if we don't have philosophical training or economic training, in making policy proposals that are sophisticated. You know, I don't think you have to be a moral philosopher to be able to make an argument about, you know, how much wealth should be redistributed, you know, whether, you know, pure egalitarianism or something else is the ideal. I think anyone can make that type of argument. But the point is if you make that argument, you have to be explicit about it. You should, you know, talk about what your moral assumptions are if you're making an argument that making a proposal that's going to have an impact on the distribution of wealth.
If I may quickly follow up, so if we follow your advice, being a law professor doing law economics, we want to make all those normative arguments. Is there a framework that we could say, okay, there's a conflict between distribution of wealth, other value, and efficiency, and this is like the step-by-step thinking module that we can go through to really put this together? Because I think at least the philosophical literature I read usually ignore the efficiency value, while the normative economics literature ignore other values. So it's kind of like you have to put 2 trainings or 3 trainings together, but then there is this meta question of which prevail under what condition, and I don't think there is readily available theory or thinking module to help us do so.
Right. No, I don't think there is. I think it's more of a pragmatic judgment that people have to make. I mean, policy is difficult. You know, doing policy is difficult, and there's no algorithm or even framework. I think. Well, there's no algorithm for weighing these different values, but I do think it's more a matter of being conscious about the assumptions one's making, and so. You know, you can write an article without talking about philosophy as long as you acknowledge that you're making certain assumptions and that therefore people will not necessarily accept your conclusion. Or you can try to do the philosophical work yourself. I think either of those approaches is reasonable. Hey, Fernando, why don't I just read these chat? I can just read aloud the questions in the chat.
There are, I mean, I already formulated one to you.
Okay, go ahead.
Read that you can read directly and answer directly.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. So in the case of the, one question is about the Kaplan and Chevelle mechanism, and the question is whether ordinary people will ever really report their tax errors. You know, it depends on how the system is designed. From time to time, tax amnesties are implemented, which sometimes are successful. There's a literature on this in the United States because sometimes these are done by states and sometimes by the national government. And a tax amnesty is a little bit like the Kaplan and Chevelle mechanism. If you report errors or, you know, if you've concealed income in the past and report it, we will, you know, we will not punish you as long as you pay the normal penalties and interest and the amount that's due. If you don't report it, though, we're going to do audits, and if we find out, we will sanction you. And the literature suggests that that does work. But I think in, in normal circumstances, people are not going, I agree, people are not going to report errors that they've made in the past. Although I suspect corporations do because they're worried about more serious sanctions. Okay, so the question about patent registration was asked. The article on the negative externalities of sharing data, the author is Acemoglu, Daron Acemoglu. If you do a Google search in Google Scholar and you put his name and data, I'm sure it'll come up near the, I can't remember the title of the article, but it's a very, very recent. It was, I think it was published in the last year or so, or maybe just posted online in the last year or so. Is there a way to measure audit probability? So the way Kaplan and Chevelle do it is there's an optimal probability of being audited. So the government should audit people, right? So the question is, should it audit 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10? And they talk about how you would determine that number as a matter of theory. It's pretty simple. It depends on how serious the wrongdoing in question is and what the cost of the audit is. It's just a trade-off. So, if we're talking about auditing corporations that, are dumping hazardous waste into rivers, that's very serious. So there probably should be very frequent audits. On the other hand, if it's something, less important, like some kind of minor accounting problem, then the audits should be less frequent. So I have the question is, I have the intuition that this whole discussion is deeper, and in the end we are questioning how reliable models are, in essence, whether relaxing some assumptions and introducing new ones would improve how models fit reality. So models, of course, are supposed to simplify reality. And so all models are to some extent inaccurate. And we use models to gain insights into how different types of laws or regulations might affect people. So obviously the insights the models give us are very approximate, and ideally we want to do empirical testing as well. But there's a difference between the models. That's really an empirical or positive question, whether a model reflects reality to a sufficiently accurate degree. I'm more concerned about the normative question. And economists don't usually talk about normative models. They talk about normative criteria. So like Calder, Hicks, Pareto, those are normative criteria. And okay, so I would agree with you that one of the questions is, are these criteria accurate in the sense that they reflect real people's real authentic normative judgments? And the answer is no, they don't. That's the problem. And I think the conclusion of welfare economics is that it may well be impossible to come up with a clean, simple standard that reflects actual normative values, because actual normative values are highly complicated. And these approximate standards are very problematic. So in the end, what we do is we don't make reform proposals in the same way that we make models. The simplifications that may be justified when building models of the empirical world may not be justified when we make reform proposals. And that's the problem. That's the problem that law and economics has disregarded. So the next question is, which efficiency approach, Pareto or Calder, Hicks, should be used in cost-benefit analysis? So cost-benefit analysis is actually a third approach. So there's Pareto, there's Calder, Hicks, and there's cost-benefit, and they're all different. Cost-benefit analysis was invented as a more practical version of Calder, Hicks. It's not exactly the same thing as Calder, Hicks. So Calder-Hicks asks whether the winners in principle could overcompensate the losers. but this is applied in a kind of an abstract way. So for example, if we're talking about, let's say, whether the minimum wage law satisfies the Calder-Hicks question, the Calder-Hicks criterion, we would ask whether the people who benefit from the minimum wage law, let's say workers, some workers, benefit more than people who are hurt, other workers, and maybe consumers. But we don't actually attach valuations, monetary valuations. If we evaluated the cost, a minimum wage loss using cost-benefit analysis, we'd actually, as Yen Qian said earlier, we'd actually kind of survey people and try to figure out what the actual monetary impact of the law would be on them. And then we sum up all of those monetary effects, and we get an answer. So cost-benefit analysis is closely related to Calder-Hicks, but the difference is that it actually uses money, in the United States dollars, whereas Calder-Hicks you can perform without actually using money. And unfortunately, when you introduce money, you create certain paradoxes, which I talk about in the book that I wrote with Matt Adler. But this is a very complicated topic that you can read about if you're interested in. Compulsory licensing of COVID vaccines. And this also asks about patents, so I've already answered that. Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean about compulsory licensing of COVID. Oh, I assume you mean the government forcing patent holders. I mean, I think the government has to compensate people. They have to compensate the pharmaceutical companies for the risks and costs. So that a compulsory license would be fine. But they do have to pay them, because then, the next time we have a pandemic, if drug companies know that they're not going to be compensated for their investments, they're not going to make their investments. So it is important to compensate them. Okay, how does intergenerational equity come into play? Oh, so that's a great question and very complicated. Economists actually, there's a huge philosophical controversy about intergenerational equity. Economists who write about, let's say, climate change tend to make, pretty reasonable assumptions about intergenerational equity. They assume that, the utility of a person living 100 years from now is equivalent to the utility of a person living now, so that people are given equal weights. And that's actually a fairly progressive view. I think in the real world, people might not care so much about the well-being of people living 100 years from now, but public policy tends to do that. And then it's just a question of discounting. So I think, as you suggest in the rest of your question, if we engage in a large capital project, or these days maybe a project to mitigate climate change, we want to take into account the benefits going into the future. Now, you apply a discount rate, because the question always is, if we take money now to build a dam or a levee or a road, for that matter, that'll benefit people far in the future, the question is whether we benefit them more by making this capital investment or setting the money aside and letting it earn interest. So you want to take into account the interest rate or the discount rate when you evaluate projects that'll benefit people in the future. Now, because the discount rate is compounding, if a project benefits people in the distant future, it's the weight of people in the distant future isn't going to have much of an effect. But that's another complicated area, but there's a great deal of economic writing about it. And here, yes, this is the paper, Too Much Data, Prices and Inefficiencies in Data Market, by Duran Nasimoglu and several other people. Thank you, Bianca. And the final question, and maybe we can stop with this question, Fernando, since it's been about an hour. I'm still wondering whether efficiency will conflict with other factors you recommend. Yes, it will conflict, right? So let me back up and try to say this. Let's take the market in kidneys again, okay? So this is a nice, clear example. So as I mentioned before, Gary Becker argued a number of years ago that the law that prohibits people from selling one of their kidneys should be repealed, because that law blocks Pareto efficient exchanges. And more intuitively, we can understand that people would probably be a lot better off in aggregate if it were possible to sell kidneys, at least as long as we had laws that guarded against exploitation or poorly informed decisions. There are lots of people in the United States who have serious kidney disease. Many of them die, and others are put on dialysis, which is a painful therapy. So there are the thousands of people, and the only way that that this problem is currently addressed is that if you're lucky enough to have a very generous relative or friend whose immune system is compatible with yours, that person may donate his kidney to you, uncompensated, right? And then there are a very small number of highly altruistic people who donate their kidneys, will donate a kidney to their strangers. But this is a market failure in the terms that economists use, because we'd be better off with a price system, because then people who currently don't give away their kidneys would be induced to do so by compensation. And so maybe compensation be $10,000 or $20,000. That's a lot of money for a lot of people. And meanwhile, we're told by doctors that if you donate one of your kidneys, you'll be fine. The probability that your other kidney will fail is very small. And if it does, we could put you on the top of the list for the next kidney transfer. Okay, so Becker made this argument, other economists have made this argument, and yet it's a powerful argument, because we're talking about thousands of people who are in a great deal of distress and other people who die as a result of insufficient supply of kidneys. And yet, as far as I know, no country in the world, with the possible exception of Iran, allows people to sell their kidneys. So why not? Well, we could say people are just making a moral error. And that's really what, I think Becker is arguing, that, maybe this aversion is old-fashioned and, reflects, I don't know, views that are no longer defensible. That's a possible argument. But the fact is that argument has made no traction. And I think the reality is that people have moral views about certain types of transactions. And many people believe that some types of transactions should be prohibited. Transactions involving sex, for example, transactions involving body parts, there are all kinds of transactions that often strike people as undignified or inappropriate. And if we are going to give weight to those moral values, then we're not going to be able to do what efficiency dictates. Now, the question then is, well, how do we weigh efficiency against these other values? And the answer is, there's no answer. There's no simple answer. There's no algorithm that tells you where to draw the line. And so the way policy is really made in the real world is people engage in debates, and sometimes people will be persuaded by moral arguments, and sometimes they won't, in which case a compromise has to be established. Now, my point here is just that there's a role for people doing law and economics in talking about, how to design a kidney exchange that reflects people's moral values or that honors people's moral values. That can be very useful work as long as those moral values are entrenched. But, it's still a challenge to understand exactly how these trade-offs should be made. So my paper is available on SSRN. Maybe Norma can make it available to people. If you email her, or you can email me, I can send you a link to it. And with that, that seems to be all the questions, Fernando.
Yes. I think we're already over 1 hour. We're almost 70 minutes. So a lot, Eric, and thanks to all participants for the not just inspiring talk, but also for the Q&A, which also has been very interesting. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day or night, as the case might be. Bye.